My name is Adil Najm. I am the director of the Frederick Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. I'm also a professor at the Department of International Relations and also at Geography and Environment. Wonderful always, as always, to see a full room. Thank you again to everyone for coming. As those of you who've been here before know, this is our regular series of seminars in which what we try to do is to bring a group of interesting people around an interesting topic, but with the very conscious effort to bring people from different disciplinary or experiential background. So what we want really to have here, this is not a research seminar in the traditional sense as much as a policy conversation. And what we want to do with these seminars, which we do about once every month, is to bring people with different experiences and different research backgrounds who are working on a similar issue. And the issue that we want to talk about today is the issue of food security. In some ways, food security, it's been a really bad year for food, but it's been such a worse year for energy that many of us have probably not paid as much attention to what has been happening to food as we have to energy. And then it's been a not very pleasant year for the financial sector in general, which has allowed us to further deviate from this. So it is important that we think a little bit about food. And we have to think with us two perspectives, and one of which comes from a very global level, one of which will look at the issue from a very local, domestic level and try to figure out what does food security really mean to the world, but also particularly to the poorest in the world, and how does it translate. Before I come to the panel, just a few announcements. As always, our next seminar will be on the 3rd of November, I believe, which is a Monday. And the subject of that will be technology and development. And we will have 3 speakers. Our first speaker is Ahmed Hashmi, who will be coming from London. He is the Vice President of Research for Technology at BP. And so he will be joining us, and he will be joined by 2 of our colleagues from BU. Dr. Ashley Stevens from the Department of Technology Transfer here at BU, and also by Professor Dilip Mukherjee from the Department of Economics at BU. And again, in that session, we will try to look at technology from all its various aspects and what it has to do with development and particularly poverty. 2 other events I very briefly want to plug in. The last week of October, we will have the whole week a set of activities around our visiting professor and a set of distinguished lectures. On Monday, the 27th, we'll have the distinguished visitor this time is Professor Simon Levin from Princeton University, who is the Moffett Professor of Biology there. And he'll be giving 2 major lectures, one on Monday, the 27th of October, on the title Cooperation and Collective Behavior from Bacteria to Global Commons. And then on Wednesday, he will be talking about ecosystems and socioeconomic systems as complex adaptive systems. There are also opportunities for students and faculty to have lunch for him on the Tuesday and the Thursday. These promise to be very exciting events, and you will get emails on this, and I hope some of you will be able to join us for that. In December, on December 8th, we'll have our major conference of the year, which this year is on the topic of where is China headed? It's being organized by our colleague and center fellow, Professor Joseph Fewsmith, and will bring together a bunch of very, very exciting scholars from all around the world to think about where China has come from in the last 30 years. It's the 30th anniversary of the reform process in China, and what the next 30 years of China will look both for China and the rest of the world. So a very, very important topic and something that's of importance to everyone. Last plug, and then we come to the event. We have a bunch of publications, and you'll see those all around as you go down the staircase. Please feel free to take copies if they interest you. We have a series of policy papers, and the first 3 are now out. You'll find copies of the first one on WTO downstairs, and very soon we'll have copies of the other 2, one of which is on South-South research partnerships, the other is on space explorations. We also have our working paper series, and the first 2 are out. The first one is by the former President of India, APJ Kalam, Abdul Kalam, on human development and space exploration. The second one is by 2 of our fellows, Kevin Gallagher and Rachel Thrasher, on issues of international trade and bilateral agreements in international trade and how they are creating a new parallel system to WTO in some ways. So all very exciting stuff. Thank you again for coming. Please feel free to take any of the publications that you see downstairs, and I hope that you will enjoy this event. So without further discussion on this, what we want to do today in this panel is to have very brief opening remarks by the 3 of us. I'll play a double role. I'll also be part participant and part moderator here. But we'll start with Hans Hoogeveen, who is the Director General of the Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality. I hope I said your last name right. I've known Hans for quite a while now, but I always called him Hans. So I might get the last name wrong, and I apologize if I do. But apart from that, he was also the president of the UNFF negotiations, the forest negotiations. He was also the president of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiations. He was the head of the EU negotiation team in 1997-2004, and last year was given a special award by the UN General Assembly for all the work he's been doing there. As I said, I worked with him for many years, and what we wanted to ask Hans here was to maybe launch us off with a few remarks, with a few thoughts on what food security means at the global level. And then we will come to Jim McCann, who I will say a bit about in a little while, to maybe guide us through what that means at the ground level. Hans, all yours.
Thank you very much, Adil, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to be here in Boston, especially with this beautiful weather. It's better than in the Netherlands, so I will stay for a couple of days more. And it seems to me a little bit strange when we are speaking here this afternoon about the food insecurity, that we have plates full of food on our knees or at the table. And it's also a little bit strange when you look what's happening in the world. It seems nowadays that we are going from one crisis to another crisis. I think we are still discussing the consequences of the financial crisis here in the United States, but also in Europe, and it will go also, I think, and the next step will go to the developing countries. And I think we should not forget that discussing and seeing the consequences of the financial crisis, that a few months ago we saw a lot of news in the papers about the food crisis, and we saw the devastating effects of the food crisis. And in my opinion, I read it in one of the papers, the food crisis is a man-made silent tsunami, because the consequences will be devastating for more than probably 1 billion of the poorest people living for less than $1 or $2 a day in the world. There is some good news, and the good news is that the prices of the commodities are going down at this moment, so that will help a little bit the burdens of the developing countries. But having said this, the bad news is that they will stay much higher than the prices we have seen in the period before 2004. And I don't think that for you I have to recall all the mix of factors which have caused the food crisis. We have seen the lack of agriculture investments. We have seen the rising of the fuel prices. We have seen the changing of diet patterns, especially in Asia and in China. And of course, we all know the devastating effects of the natural disasters. But I think when you look to the food crisis, one thing is more than clear. I think the food crisis is caused by the neglect for many years of agriculture investments in developing countries. And when we look to that neglect of investment, we are also confronted at this time of where we are living is the rising trends of energy consumption and the problems of climate change. And they all should be a major concern to us because they will have a huge impact in the future on the way we are living and especially the way people are living, for example, in China. And reports, and I think reports, we listen to them, but normally we don't act on the basis of them. These reports show that we are using far more of our natural resources than our planet can regenerate. Some of the reports indicate that we use our Earth even 4 times than we can. And let's not forget that in about a couple of years, 2050, we reach the population of 9 billion people living worldwide. And we have to feed those people. And that means that we are facing with tremendous dilemmas. And we are facing dilemmas which are called the competing claims for food and fuel. And sometimes I think, is it really a competing claim? Because when you look to the facts, at this moment only 1% of the agricultural soil is used for biofuels. And of course, if we are going 10% higher, then there could be a problem and could be a cause of food insecurity. But I think the bigger problem will be, and that's the more silent competing claim, is the competing claim for water, and especially fresh water. And you don't see that often at this moment in the newspapers. But 70% of our fresh water is used by agriculture. And if we have to increase our agricultural production, and it means that we have to use more water than ever for agriculture production. I think that is one of the real competing claims for the future. At the same time, the answers are quite easy to the competing claims. If you have to choose, of course, everybody will say, I will choose for food and not for fuel. But my question to you would be, how can we organize that? Can a national government say to their farmers, you have to produce only for food and you cannot produce for the fuel market? Look to the international governance. Which organization can make any regulations or rules about competing claims in a way that they can direct countries at the national level how to organize their agriculture? Until now, we were not able to even agree on the trade negotiations within the WTO. But at the same time, as a global society, we cannot accept these increasing levels of poverty and hunger. And we have to find solutions for these dilemmas in a more integrated and combined way. And speaking briefly about what I see as the main solutions, I think I can say that one thing is clear, there are no easy answers. But at the same time, I see efforts and possibilities to fix quite some of these problems, not only for the short term, but also for the longer term. And within the Netherlands, we did a lot of research and thinking about a 5-track approach to the food insecurity. And the first track, and I think the foremost important track to us, is that we have to respond by increasing the investments in sustainable agriculture, and especially in Africa. In many countries, the productivity can and should be improved, and of course in a sustainable way. But for that, they need technology, for that they need knowledge, and for that they need capacity building. And I think, in my opinion, the key words are innovation, for example, via biotechnology, and sustainability. If we can bring that knowledge to those countries, especially in Africa, I know for sure that they can increase their production and they can overcome parts of their food insecurity. Secondly, I think we have to create an enabling environment. In the end, only the private sector can do it. The farmers themselves have to be educated and they have to increase their production. But the private sector, when we look to the private sector and we want to have their investments, we have to create conditions, and they have to be set by the governments and frameworks in which we can attract real investments in Africa. And I think especially land tenure rights are critical for this. Thirdly, the third track, in my opinion, is important, is developing sustainable production chains. We have to look to the whole production chain, starting from the production itself, the processing, the marketing, and at the end, how to sell it to the consumers. And of course, it's not only the food safety, but also the food quality will be an issue there. And fourthly, I think we have to improve market access. We have to support initiatives in developing local and regional markets. Within the EU, our common market is always blamed for a lot of things. But when we have had the Second World War, we were also in a devastating situation. And our common market, the creation of a common market, helped our farmers to increase their production so that the EU could be self-sufficient again. I think we can learn from, I think, the positive elements of a common market, and of course we can also learn from our failures. And the fifth, and of course not the least important track, is, in my opinion, creating food security and especially giving emergency food aid. And I think there, what we always say, the need for enhanced safety nets, especially, and also I think the increased lending possibilities for farmers via microcredits. As a last issue, I would like to focus on the role of governance. And of course, where you come internationally, everybody speaks about good governance. I will not speak about good governance because, in my opinion, I think we can never speak about good governance, because when you look to the financial crisis in the US and in Europe, I think we can doubt whether there was good governance in your or our countries. But I think first, at the national level, in order to ensure a long-term response, I think it's important that the goals of poverty eradication, food security, and our management of natural resources need to be seen interlinked. And when we address these issues, we should try to find coherent and combined solutions. Too much focus nowadays is going to single issues, like, for example, climate change. If you see the investments worldwide and also in Europe in climate change, they are far more higher than we ever can get for agriculture. And we should ask ourselves the question, is that the right direction? I think secondly, we have to look to the international organizations. Next year, the Commission on Sustainable Development will focus on agricultural development and will focus on the food crisis. And hopefully we can there find a combined and coherent way forward at the international level. And we see some good signs at the international level. I think especially the establishment of the United Nations Task Force on Food Security is positive. And even more positive is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, the initiative of Kofi Annan, together with, I think, some important bills of your country, like Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. Secondly, I think we have to look to international trade. And we lost an important opportunity this year, but we have to look for new opportunities to make the Doha round a real success. And I was participating on behalf of the Netherlands in the negotiations in Geneva this year. And it was a real pity that the United States pulled the plug out of these negotiations. And for us, it was quite difficult to understand why they did it, because the issue they gave for not succeeding in the negotiations was the special safeguard mechanism for developing countries, so that they could protect their agriculture markets in times of crisis. And we ask ourselves the question, and I think we should ask ourselves the question, how did the Western world protect its markets the last century? And then I think we know the answer for the way forward. Thirdly, I think governance can and should take a leading role, and not only the donor countries, but also the developing countries themselves. They have to create an enabling environment for private investments. They have to focus on agricultural investments again. And of course, the second part and responsibility lies with the donor countries. As the Netherlands, we have taken the initiative to donate $50 million per year extra for agricultural development in Africa. And we are now promoting this idea within the EU, and hopefully at least $1 billion this year will be made available for agricultural development in Africa. Hopefully this will be an example which will be followed by other regions. But I think at the end, only if we work together at the international level, if we work together with the private sector and with the people living on the ground, I think we can find real solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hans, for that very comprehensive and actually really thought-provoking sort of set of issues that you've raised. If my understanding from what you're saying and otherwise too is that you have to understand food as a global issue. And we'll come in a minute to also the point that while you have to understand it as a global issue, you cannot understand it only as a global issue if you don't understand those linkages. But the important point for me that I did want to highlight is this notion of competing claims. But and the policy implication, or one of the policy implications, is that we have actually turned issues into competitors for our attention. That if I'm more interested in climate change, I should therefore be somehow less interested in food, as if there is a zero-sum ability to be interested. And that becomes problematic when you have issues like food, which are in fact linked to everything. That you are not going to solve one problem more by solving another problem less. And very often it seems to me, and we'll come to this in a minute, that maybe the answer lies as much in the connections between issues and how we've organized our conversations, governance as well as study, is to separate these issues, as if climate is a separate issue and food is a separate issue and energy is a separate issue, when in the world they may not be. But let me not pontificate on that anymore, just by way of saying you've raised a number of issues, at least in my head, that are worth thinking about. Let me go directly to my colleague Jim McCann to take us down from the global to the very local. And to help us explore those linkages between the two, but also to help us understand what does food insecurity really mean when you are poor, either as a country and, more importantly, as a household, and how does it actually translate, particularly, I assume Jim will be talking about the African context. Jim McCann is the director of the African Studies Center here at Boston University. He's a professor of history here at Boston University and has done a lot of work on the ecological history of Africa, including in his recent book, Maize and Grace. Jim.
Thank you, Adil. This is a very different perspective, both from a disciplinary point of view of myself as a historian, and also from the idea that I would reflect on some of these issues at the ground level. And by ground level, I mean soil, dirt, asphalt sometimes, but talking about what goes on with from a point of view of the farmer, be he a man or be she a woman, standing at the gate of their farm. Economists talk about farm gate prices, but I'm really talking about farm gate. What they see, what they think about, what's the next important thing for them. But it occurred to me as we're comparing the large global scale to that point of view from the farm gate, is that I actually made this alliterative. 4 things: fuel, food, finance, read credit, and fertilizer, also related to. Those are all some of the crises that Hans mentioned as being global crises. Well, they're the exact crises that face that farmer, thinking about what he or she, in my case, the farm decisions are made primarily by men, but also women have a role. But to read them from their point of view, we imagine what they're thinking about, what they have to plan for the next year. One of the reasons why I've been close to this issue is because we have a project that works with 22 farmers in the southeastern part of Ethiopia. And so we work day to day with the farmers. What do they need? What are their priorities? Because for our project to go, we have got to provide them with the basic issues of life. Not food, they're growing their own food. But on issues about what do they have to pay for their seeds, what do they have to pay for their fertilizer, how do they have to get along with governance in order to have access to these things? Because they don't come in a free market. There are very few free markets, and I think there are probably fewer still as we think about what's happening on Wall Street and whatever the appropriate street in Amsterdam or The Hague would be. So think about the point of view, what we learn from talking to farmers themselves. One of the issues is that in a crisis situation, like Ethiopia is one of our iconic food crisis situations, and it is truly so. But if you look at Ethiopia on the ground and you work in the place I'm working, you would look at it and say, well, so what's the food crisis? It's green. There are fields of maize. There are fields of different kinds of grain, red peppers, the kinds of things that would make you think this looks prosperous. But if you look at the country as a whole, the crisis areas that reported on by UNICEF and by different international agencies, you identify that as being the peripheral zones. It's not every place which is in food crisis, so it's an issue of distribution. Who gets access to the food? Who gets access to what Amartya Sen would call the entitlements? What allows you to have access to food to eat? It's either money or effective people who care about you enough to give it to you. It's about political connections, and it's about a range of things that allows you to say, this food is something I can now consume. And I think Sen's idea about that is fundamental, and I've never found a reason to move away from it, even to a small degree. So those farmers that I'm working with are incipient commercial farmers. They're thinking about what they're going to get to the market, what they're going to be paid for their food, how much they're going to have to pay for their fertilizer, which they must have to do any of the agricultural improvements that we're talking about. GMO, otherwise, requires fertilizer. Chemical fertilizers are also part of the competing interests, stakeholders in the oil industry. The international circulation of fertilizer is also connected to food and fuel. And also, how are you going to get access to seed? In a situation like Ethiopia, or we can take Zimbabwe, or we can take Mozambique, any of these places in Africa or elsewhere in the world, it is a political question of who gets access to that food. And let me give you an example, one of my favorites. If we were to drive by on the tarmac road that goes past our farmers, or we're riding on a mule or in a little bajaj, the mobilette that are increasingly common in rural areas of Ethiopia, we'd look at a field and I'd say, look at that field of maize over there. You see that the tassels some of them are red and some of them are white. So what? Well, go back to Genetics 101. The red tassels are purebred hybrid seed, which is the ideal of the international agricultural development agencies to say, let's get better seeds in the hands of these farmers. Well, the farmer who has more of the red seed probably is closer politically to his local representative who goes to the agriculture agency and says, this guy's on the top of the list. If there are more white tassels in his maize field, it says he got on the bottom of the list. He's going to lose something like 15 to 30% of his yield. And probably he doesn't have access to fertilizer as sort of tightly knit as the person who had all that nice red tasseling. So on the field itself, you can see what's going on with respect to politics, with respect to agricultural technology, with respect to prices for the farmer had to pay for the seed, the farmer had to pay for the fertilizer, and what connections he has to get it first. Because if you plant 2 weeks late, you're in trouble. And the ones who plant early are also the ones that have connections politically or otherwise. And the farmers that we work with, because we pay them, we buy their seed and buy their fertilizer as a recompense for them working with our project, they are paying this year compared to last year 4 times more. Imagine if the food sources in the U.S. were 400% inflation. Doesn't quite reach the levels of Zimbabwe, those of you who have heard those horrific stories. But nonetheless, the inputs that farmers need to participate and to produce food so it can reach those areas that are in fact the ones affected by famine is a question of politics, it's a question of international commodity prices, and the farmer who's standing there in their gate, saying, what do I do next, what do I need in order to make my small farm, 5-acre farm, more productive? How do I get the fertilizer? That's connected to international prices for fuel. It's connected to whether or not I get in line first or whether my local political representative or party representative puts me high on the list. Depends on the seed I have, which is improved seed that allows me to go from 3 tons per hectare to 6 to 8 tons per hectare. So it matters a whole lot to that farmer. They get access to the technology. They're quite willing to do it. They adapt very quickly. But they're calculating, what do I have to do to make sure I'm politically on the right side of things, that I have access to this, I'm close enough to the road to be able to have these things delivered to me. The story, when I was in Ethiopia this last summer, I had on my mobile phone, which works sometimes, was a call from BBC. And they said, we have these reports from UNICEF about starvation in Ethiopia. Can you give us your perspective on the ground? I said, well, that's not what I'm really here for, but sure, we can talk about that. And so I went out, keeping this in mind, what am I going to say? Walking through the streets of Addis Ababa, down the road to the old, beautiful train station built by the French and finished in 1917, beautiful architecture, and there's a kind of a marketplace in front of that. But of course, the train doesn't work anymore. No trains, for various reasons having to do with the collapse of the economy, capital investments in infrastructure, et cetera. There's no train. But the man with a wheelbarrow is selling me these beautiful little pomodori pelati, the Italian-style tomatoes, which he's willing to sell me for 30 cents a pound. And they're beautiful. They're nicer than what you can find here. So I can buy incredibly inexpensive tomatoes in the country which has the food crisis that that UNICEF and BBC are quite properly reporting on as being in food crisis. So reconcile that with the fact that these farmers who are not in a condition of malnutrition, the farmers I'm talking about working with, but yet they're the local producers whose food products ultimately would reach those people who are in crisis on the Somali border, the eastern border with near the Red Sea. The farmers who are in crisis, quite genuinely so, whose children are malnourished, who are moving to camps to try to plead for another kind of entitlement, the entitlement that they get from being recognized as impoverished and malnourished. So how does it get from the place that's producing large amounts, it has a crisis with how do I get access to credit, how do I get access to good seed, how does it reach the person who's in the periphery? And that's the fundamental issue. What we learned from Sen, and what I learned time and time again, is it's really about what are the networks of distribution. There are issues about politics, issues about financial exchanges, issues about who has access to income or who has access to government's attention. So we can talk much more about these issues, but let me end there. Just a different perspective on the connectedness of things. Because again, food, fertilizer, fuel, finance. International crises in every one of these things. Also, the farmers themselves, this is foremost on their minds.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that. The 4 Fs sounds like my undergrad transcript, but but that being as it might, I think you've given us a very good and very powerful framework to look at some of these connections. And I must confess, while I'd probably thought of the first 3, I hadn't fully appreciated the importance of the 4th. Right. Well, now that no one has credit, we can change it to anything we want. But but I think especially the fertilizer one is really something that a lot of us miss. Because in some ways, we think of food as what comes at the end of the process. But as you rightly point out, if you aren't really looking at what's going into the process and the farmer's ability to get hold of those resources, including fertilizer, that's going to impact that. So thank you very much. Let me just add a few comments on this, which in many ways build very well from what the two of you have said. Because I think when I hear the two of you, you're talking about there are these global challenges, they have to be recognized at global level, but they have to be then translated at the local level, and a lot happens between the global and the local. As Amartya Sen points out, and as you mentioned, sort of the questions of access. And one of the ways in which access either becomes accessible or not is the whole mechanisms of governance. That is one of the ways in which all of this gets translated, and that's the level that I want to talk about just a bit. Now, I should add here that what I'm going to say is based on ongoing research here at the Pardee Center, really being led by this very bright, wonderful young fellow at the center, Roshan Malik, who's not able to be here today, but he and I are working on this paper. And so I wanted to present some of the preliminary findings that we are finding on this issue of trying to link governance issues or malgovernance with food insecurity. I should also note sort of that it's very good that you mentioned Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen was the first visiting Pardee professor here at the Pardee Center, and we now host at the center the Secretariat of the Human Development and Capabilities Association that Amartya is a major player in. He's trying to sort of look at this notion of capabilities as the vehicle that translates access into reality. So what we try to do in this work, and I'm not going to go through the details, it's fairly sort of quantitative, but try to give some highlights. And I think this links the global to the local in some ways, is we said, okay, it's been a bad year. Let's look at where in the world do we find chronic insecurity. And the way we defined it was fairly simple. We looked at FAO every 4 months now, comes with a list of countries that are likely to be food insecure in the next year. And we said, what are the countries that have been consistently on this list for most part of the last 10 years? What are the countries that keep being on this list every 4 months? So let's just look at where in the world are you finding chronic food insecurity. Then we said there are multiple efforts out there to say where in the world are countries that are suffering from chronic bad governance. So there are lists of failed states, there is the Human Development Index, there is the list of bad governance that the World Bank makes, and we looked at all of those lists. And we said, if we put these two lists together, do we see something that is correlated between the two? So causality might come at the later point, but at the first point, where are we finding this? And one of the things that we added to this, we said, let's go and look at the last year FROZ news reports on where did actual violence over food happen in the world. There are about 30 countries in the last year where actual violence broke out on food. So that means that someone has to go and hit someone physically because of access to food. And so we said that's a particular type of insecurity because you have to be led to that. And I'll spare you all the sort of math here. We tried to correlate all of these and said, are there any large patterns, large lessons emerging? And we thought we came up with 5 key propositions or lessons in doing this analysis. As I said, this is still work in progress, but I wanted to at least share some of the emerging findings. The first was probably the most simplest one. That first, by applying, what we did was we applied a food production and pricing lens. We said, okay, what's happening to food production? What's happening to food price? What's happening to food demand? Let's just look at those graphs. And when we apply that lens, we learn what kind of is obvious, that there is a significant food crisis, partly led by the population rise that Hans talked about, partly led by decreasing access, largely led also by increasing demand and increasing affluence in number of parts of the world, both within countries and across countries, larger demands from India, larger demands from China, and so on and so forth on food. And the trends all seem to suggest this is not going to subside. That habits are changing. It's probably not a bad thing if a lot of people are actually using slightly more calories, because it's not as if all of them are getting a waistline that looks like mine. A lot of them were undernourished to begin with, so that's not a bad thing. And that was one trend, simple. The second one was the more interesting. Now we said, let's apply a food insecurity lens. Let's look at the food insecurity numbers on what are the countries that are there, and then correlate it with governance. And what we find is that the most chronically food insecure countries, the countries that are perpetually on that list, have some of the worst governance indicators. So you will find the same countries appearing again and again on the failed index list. You'll find the same country at the bottom of the human development indicators. You'll find the same countries at the bottom of the World Bank's governance lists. So there is some correlation, again, not surprising, but those are not necessarily the countries at the very bottom of the governance indicators. And at a minimum, what we think we can say is that when you have food insecurity, it makes your governance worse. Because there's one more stress in the country for people to fight about, one more avenue for possible corruption, one more level of things. So it becomes not that it's causing it to be less, but it's one more stress on the governance system. So if you're seeking good governance, it becomes one more stress. Third, we said, let's apply the governance indicators. Let's look at the governance list and look at who's at the bottom of that and what are their food insecurity numbers. And what we find is, as I said, not all the countries at the bottom of the governance indicators necessarily had food insecurity, but the correlation was again very high. A very large number of them were either borderline or already there. And again, sort of at a very basic level, the policy sort of lesson there, if one were sitting at the UN, would be that please keep an eye on the food situations in these places. They're already borderline, they're already sort of falling off. And here is one more trigger that you can see as a potential, so a kind of an early warning. And in some ways, a good example of that is my own country, Pakistan, and neighboring Afghanistan. Pakistan is one of the 30 countries in which food riots broke out. Pakistan is a country that, people like me grew up very proud in our social science books of how we were a great breadbasket, how we had this great irrigation system. So a country that grows up with a self-perception of agricultural productivity, and you get these violent food riots, and you start probing why it is happening. It's partly happening because the crop was bad, but it wasn't that bad. Amartya again is proved here, as he was in his earlier work in Bangladesh and others. Part of the stress comes from neighboring Afghanistan, where you also have insecurity and high violence, high demand coming in, and what you get is massive amounts of illegal, in this case, trade in food. And it's kind of amongst the saddest trade because in many ways it was drugs for food kind of transfers happening. Warlords in both sort of the border, across the borders on sides get to control the food trade. But again, when you start looking at this, the point here is look for the food as one more indicator of where insecurity is going to fall off the wagon. The fourth thing we looked at was the violence and conflict lens. So we said, okay, let's look at the countries where violence breaks out. At first we were surprised, but only because we weren't thinking hard enough. The countries with the most chronic stress were not the countries where violence broke out. And we said, well, that doesn't make sense. If the worst stress is here, shouldn't this be the place where people fight? Well, you think a little bit more about that and you realize, no, if you have been having this stress the last 10 years, you have already begun to cope with it. You've developed a certain resilience. You've developed certain habits. You've developed certain ways of anticipating that you're going to be food insecure the next year too, and dealing with it. That doesn't mean the problem has been solved, but that means that people in their ingenuity do understand what is coming down the pike. Where do the violence break out? It breaks out in Saudi Arabia. It breaks out in Dubai, one of the richest places in the world. It breaks out in Pakistan. It breaks out in places where people are actually used not to have food stress. And then you hit them with that. And that sudden shock is what partly motivates this, or that's at least what we are thinking. And finally, we look at human development indicators and apply them in conjunction with these two, and essentially come to the sense, and again, not a surprise, but important to put forth, that a triple whammy is really in store for a whole set of countries, which means that the countries that have the worst food insecurity indicators are also the same countries that have the most governance stress, are also the same country that have the greatest human deprivation stress. So essentially, each of those has the potential to compound on the others. And so in some ways, this brings me full circle to the point that Hans had started us off with, and I think Jim was also making, that you have to look at the connection of these things, that you're not going to just like you're not going to get to the bottom of food insecurity simply by measuring the amount of grain that was grown in a year. Simply, you're probably not going to get to the bottom of insecurity by simply measuring the immediate metrics of insecurity, such as violence and so on and so forth. And it behooves us to look at those connections between issues, because they trigger trigger insecurity, and they compound insecurity. So let me leave it at that. Thank once again, now going back to my moderator roles, my two colleagues here, for actually laying out for us a wide but hopefully interconnected set of issues to think about, and I invite you to think about it and maybe help us think more about it with your questions. Yes, we have a mic there, so please do speak in that. If you can stand and also say where you are from. I know where you are from, and you're going to tell us about your ranch.
Hello, my name is Jess Womack. I'm from Texas and here as a master's student. I worked in Brazil this summer on a sustainable agriculture project. And my question is that how to resolve, I think one of the biggest problems in all of this and glaring contradictions is that sustainable agriculture and sustainable agriculture practices cost more for producers. It requires better technologies. It requires fencing out sensitive ecosystems and areas, and in many cases it lowers yields, which is all possible, but it also increases the food prices, which is a problem with poor, the urban poor and developing countries. So I wonder, as we search for a way to increase sustainable agriculture, how do we resolve that conflict between the needed higher prices for producers to produce in a sustainable manner?
Anyone?
I can say that one of the conundra of governments is that they realize the formula of prices in urban areas. Revolutions, political upheavals are urban phenomena. They may filter out into rural areas and build a base there, but they're afraid about having high, especially high prices in places where people anticipate having life being cheap. That creates a problem for governments because they then want to be sure that the prices are sustained and made low when the farmer's incentive comes from the prices. Regardless of the kind of governments, farmers respond very quickly to price incentives, and therefore they want to get the inputs. They want to find ways of getting access to inputs, and that's the problem that we face. That question of governance worries first because governance lives in urban areas, for the most part. That's where the decision makers are. They have their own decisions about sustainability.
Insecurity also lives in urban areas, I wonder. But I wonder if insecurity lives more in urban areas than in rural. Is that?
And people are aware of inequities in urban areas. So therefore, the political dynamite or gunpowder is there, and in rural areas tend to be slower by way of response. And if you look at the cases we have of insurrections, they're fundamentally, I would argue, urban-based, even though they reflect on rural questions ultimately.
Hans?
Yeah, my question would be whether sustainable agriculture is more expensive than current agriculture practices in, for example, developing countries. We have seen results. We developed demonstration farms in China and in Vietnam, where we showed it was a dairy farm and it was also a pig farm. There we showed with the use of new technologies, the use of different inputs, fertilizers, different feed, which is not more expensive, but at the end less expensive for the farmers. We showed the farmers in their situation, in their circumstances, that the end product could even be less expensive than the products they were producing now and selling now. And of course it depends, and therefore I was mentioning the whole food chain, because what you now see, and what we also see in Ethiopia, is that a lot of farmers get less for the products because they don't have a position in the whole food chain. When you look to the retail sector, most of the benefits are going to the retail sector. And what we have seen in the history of the agricultural development in the Netherlands, and we are now the second largest exporter worldwide, is that the farmers saw those problems, and it were in the beginning small farmers, but they combined their efforts in cooperatives, and with working within cooperatives, they got a position with regard to the retail sector, and they got higher prices for the products because they could choose to which retailer they were selling their products. If we can help the farmers in some of the developing countries to work within the cooperatives, to share inputs, to give them knowledge about the farming on the same land. Because at the end, if you have to use new land again, it will not only be sustainable, but will be more expensive as well. If we give them more effective seed, for example, it will help them not only to get better prices, but it can also help them to produce in a more sustainable way. And for one of the examples, for example, which we have now is with biotechnology and rice production, is we have now a certain rice which uses about half less water than the current rice production. So if we can introduce those production methods in those countries, it will help them tremendously.
Yeah, but one of the obvious things that both of you mentioned is looking at the farmer, and again, sort of, this is the utility I get from such conversations. In our entire work, we actually didn't look at the farmer. Right? We were looking at food when it reaches the consumer. That's where the price signal that we received was coming from, and so being cognizant of what it means across the chain, and especially at the farm gate, as you so eloquently put it, is again an important thing in this. Let me actually give the floor to Professor Hasnath, and then I'll come to you, Franz.
I have one small question and one big question. The small one, I came from a country 30 years ago, which perpetually suffers from food deficit, and that is Bangladesh. But interesting enough, it is not the case of Ethiopia, where it is lack of rain, but it is more of rain. That means a flood, right? But that is not my question. My question is that before coming to this house, I was thinking that what are the kinds of discussion will make all these three professors. And I had three things in mind. I found two. One is missing, but one is extra, and that is finance. And what is missing, that is feed. That means fodder, right? Because in Latin America, the large multinationals, including the continental grains, they are producing a lot of meats for export, but at the cost of producing less feed, directly or indirectly. So if you can focus on that point. Yeah. And another one is more of philosophical, that is not going to be decided in this room. That is, the whole concept of sustainable development is sustainable. I'm making this comment against the concept of whole neoclassical market economy and the miserable failure of that concept in today's crisis. We developed in 60s and 70s a lot of house-ending concept, and one of them is sustainable. I'm not undermining the concept, because I myself is the victim of unsustainability. Lands are being eroded, ecosystems are being destroyed. It is an issue, right? But how this issue is or should be addressed to the other issues like poverty, hunger, famine. Thank you.
Okay, that's one big canvas. I think sort of the point about feed and livestock is an important one, because that's something that has competed with food for a long time. We haven't talked about it the way we now talk about biofuels, but in some ways it's a very parallel issue of the livestock system that we've created, though it varies across countries. Either of you wants to?
Say something about the livestock issue and the feed question. It's a very important part of it, because what livestock eats, livestock are saleable commodities. They're ways of saving capital for a household for social purposes, to provide for marriage of the next generation, to provide a means by which you sell off during bad years. But one of the indicators I use, I think perhaps there's someone back there who's driven with me, been traveling through the countryside. If I see a donkey carrying a load 3 times its size of straw or hay, that tells me something immediately. It means there's a market for it. Therefore, there's a shortage of land devoted to what the livestock need to sustain themselves, whether it's production of cheese or of milk or of meat. That this tells you that the economy is closely integrated, and the farm is selling off one of its surpluses to a market that needs it. So whether you go back to Dutch history or Italian history, whether you're talking about Parmesan, prosciutto in northern Italy, or the Dutch exports, dried milk, all of those things, cheeses, that are really a byproduct of the livestock economy. And on the second question, sustainability, historically, I think, is not a helpful term. Livestock, agriculture is not sustainable by its definition. Adaptability, certain concepts help us. But sustainability is problematic if we look historically, because these are all adjustments that are made by farmers to their immediate situation. The long-term result may well be an agricultural system that produces wealth and sustains a population and produces political stability. But agriculture, from a historian of the environment's point of view, is not a helpful term. It's just not, it can't continue the way it is.
So for someone who teaches a course on sustainable development, you're threatening my livelihood right there. But that being
It's all about livelihoods, right?
it's all about livelihoods ultimately.
I will begin with the last question because it triggers me because I think you are addressing one of the biggest problems which we are facing when we speak about sustainable development. Because especially when you speak about development, you want to improve a situation. And I believe in the concept of sustainable development because it interlinks economic growth with certain conditions of the environment and, of course, conditions of social development. But at the same time, it's easy for the Western world to speak about sustainable development because it was invented, I think, not by developing countries, but by the Western world. But there is a real problem, because what the Western world is saying, and I use the example often in the forest issue, is we have cut for 70% in the last 50 years our forests in Europe. Doing so, we had a tremendous economic development, and we became rich. Now, we are more or less denying that same development to developing countries, because we say now we have to maintain and restore our forests worldwide. And we can only do that because if we don't compensate them for keeping and maintaining those forests, we deny them the same development as we did, destroying part of our forest. And I think that's an issue which at this moment is impossible to address at the political level, because it means that you get a different situation. Because now we speak about one of the most difficult issues for the forest arena was the financing, of course, financing for the means of implementation of sustainable forest management. And we developed a portfolio approach where we try to get the private sector involved as well. But if you go along these lines, if we really want to tackle the issue and say, okay, we want to maintain and sustainably manage our forests worldwide now, there has to be a compensation mechanism between North and South. And especially in the financial crisis, you speak about billions of dollars. And only then sustainable development can be in reach of also the developing countries. Otherwise, then I think there is a competing claim between economic development and sustainable development. And I know what I would choose if I was a member of a government of a developing country.
Thanks, Hans. Just to plug the work some of the work that Hans just mentioned with the portfolio approach. There is that available as a publication downstairs. If anyone wants to learn more about it, you can pick one on your way down. I wanted to introduce Franz Gassner, who's here actually by way of the Clinton Global Initiative, is where he's just come from. But one is particularly proud and happy to have him here because he's a former student here at Boston University. I think he defended his thesis right in this space and is now working very practically at the hands dirty level on food insecurity. Franz.
Thanks. I'm actually much smaller than I was last time I defended my thesis, when I was about 20 pounds heavier. And I think you may be a couple pounds.
Thank you for reminding me that I'm 20 pounds heavier. But
Professor Najm is also very tall, which I didn't realize before, at least for somebody from that part of the world. I cleaned up a little bit for the Clinton Global Initiative. I've actually been living with farmers. I've been in India for 2 years and living in a pretty interesting place for the past 5 months in a rural area where about 60% of the people derive their incomes or their livelihoods from agriculture. But only about 92% of the land is irrigated. So we're doing a lot of what you talked about in terms of working with, food, fuel, finance, fertilizer, and fodder. But there are a couple Hindi words too, which are jal, jungle, jameen, janwar, and John, which are essentially some of the same issues with the addition of people, basically. But 5 is better than 6. It's more easy to remember. So I'm wondering, we're working now with Ashoka, which is, we're using Ashoka as sort of a engine to help us improve our farmers' agricultural productivity. And I'm working for a giant steel company that has a foundation where the CEO has since retired and devoted himself completely to this basically social enterprise that he created. So we're looking into the future as far as connecting farmers with markets, and I want to know, with the sort of issues, the 5 Fs or the 5 Js, what are some of the issues that farmers have to worry about once they start connecting to a fast-growing retail market? When you have a very slow-growing agricultural sector at 2 or 3%, and a very fast-growing retail sector at about 30%, when farmers start bringing food away from the villages and into the cities at a much greater pace in order to get income to themselves, what are sort of some of the inequalities or issues that you've seen in Ethiopia in your project with the 22 farmers, or you in terms of from the different issues you've seen in Vietnam or elsewhere?
I think especially when you see an increase of production and the farmers have the chance to have a rapid growth and perhaps accessing markets in cities or even outside of the country, I think one of the most important things is to try to, and therefore I mentioned the cooperatives, to work together as soon as possible with other farmers to get a market position as a cooperative or some kind of a combination with other farmers. Because otherwise, if an individual grower finds that market, he will be shown that the retail sector is not thinking about his interest or her interest, thinking about their own interest. And only when they have position, they can maintain a certain position for a longer term. I think secondly, I think they have to look to the retail sector and try to see how they can connect not only with the retail sector but also the demands outside of the country and how to develop and how to get a system in place where they can meet, for example, the food standards of countries outside of Ethiopia or Vietnam. Because, for example, we are working with Vietnam and helping them with the techniques to measure and to inspect their shrimps, because there are a lot of export of shrimp is going now to the Netherlands and to Europe. But until recently, they could not meet our food standards. And so you saw a fisherman improving and increasing its production, but they couldn't sell to the retail sector, but the retail sector couldn't sell it to the markets outside of Vietnam. And what we have done now, and that's a government-to-government cooperation, is that we help them to develop laboratories and those techniques to inspect the shrimps. Secondly, what we did, we brought them into connection with Dutch importers and exporters, so that they had, besides the retail sector, they had also their direct link with the importers in Europe, and that gave them also a position, not only together with other fishermen, but also a position directly to the importers, in which they could get a better price for their shrimps when they sold it to their retail sector.
Okay, well, we were talking a little bit. I connected this. We had a conversation before the official opening of about cut flowers and why I go to Amsterdam to go to Ethiopia. Because there's a flight that goes every day, goes Amsterdam, Khartoum for an hour, Addis Ababa, and then directly back to Amsterdam. For me, it's the most convenient flight. Well, KLM doesn't really care that I want to be on that flight. What they care about is what is in their cargo hold, which are cut flowers. Time-sensitive, perishable goods that link Ethiopian income to those urban folks who are doing the flower work. They're not farmers. Directly to the world market, there in the flower, Amsterdam that city is where the flower exchange is, right?
Yeah, Alsmeer, that's a city.
Oh, okay. So
near to Amsterdam, yeah.
So this connection is one that suggests time, infrastructure. Add to that roads and means of moving goods, whether they're the little bajaj that takes people around the farmers back and forth to their field, to the market, the mobile phone that allows them to call and see what the prices are. Within seconds, you can find out what the prices are all over the country because they now have mobile telephone networks, microwave centers. So those infrastructures, but back to, I would agree very much that the cooperative way of acquiring inputs and of distributing to a marketplace is one of the most important features of history of U.S. agriculture, European agriculture, in this case, relatively free-standing cooperative units, not organized by the government. That creates a problem.
If I can also add slightly more bluntly, and I don't know if my colleagues will agree, part of the problem when you have very small farmers and you're trying to link them to larger markets is larger markets do not respect the logics of very small producers. So either the producers grow through cooperatives or through buyouts, and we've seen this in fishing much more, certainly much more recently, or something really happens to the small farmer. They will have to change somehow because if that is the enterprise that large markets are now going to sort of get more and more from these very many small farmers, something has to be found. Cooperatives are one obvious route to that. But there are other routes which might be less desirable for the small farmer, but might be very desirable for the market, as in the birth of the giant farm. And if you are working in the area you're working in, then one has to ask the question, well, if the route that you go on is the giant farm, where you go on the farm in a helicopter because it's that large now, then where has the small farmer gone? And in some ways, I would again be cognizant of being aware that part of this is about the farmer. I should add, I think sort of the image of the flower market is a very, very good one. Hans' colleagues, Patrick, who's sitting there, took me one day at 5 a.m. to see the cut flower market. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And in some ways, it is that very visual reminder of just how global and globalized this commodity, but the larger agriculture market has been, and how long it has been like that. And maybe the current financial market starts helping us understand what happens to those intricate infrastructures of global connections if you don't get them right. Now, at least the day I went, the flower market seemed to be working extremely well. You know, people would cart in these wonderful flowers, and people would bid for them. But it is a reminder of just how global a commodity these things are.
With one short thing that Hans had mentioned to me when we had that conversation, which is why the cut flower industry has moved from Kenya to Ethiopia, almost overnight, short period of time, has to do with political security and the security of the workers and their families in which place they would rather live. And so you have the connectedness goes beyond just economic, measurable kinds of features.
Yeah, I was coming to that because two remarks. We have a very short movie about the flowers, and there you see that a rose which is grown in Kenya is cut early in the morning, goes into a plane, goes to Amsterdam, is sold via the worldwide market in Aalsmeer, and goes again in a plane and is sold the same evening in New York to a person, of course, who gives it to a lady. But
thank you for reminding me.
That shows how a chain is managed. And coming to sustainable development, what we have seen there, and a lot of Dutch growers went to Kenya, now are in Ethiopia. There is a study done between the UK farmers in Kenya and the Dutch farmers. And the Dutch farmers did not only, of course, try to increase their production in Kenya, but were also looking to parts of sustainable development. And they built houses for their workers. They built schools. They built small medical services for their workers. And you saw a much higher production than the UK farmers, which didn't do all those things. And that was more or less a small example of a concept of sustainable development, where you look not only to your production, but you look also to the social circumstances in which your workers are living and working. And that helps not only increase your production, but it gives also a situation where your workers will be bound to your farm, which help increasing the products. And I think that are lessons learned, which not often are showed worldwide as good examples.
As I said, I'm fascinated by this flower example, not simply because flowers are fascinating, but because it reminds you of just how global these trade in agricultural commodities are and have been. You can see the fingerprint of the very local on the global very, very immediately, much more immediately than we can in many other areas that we talk about in talking about globalization of these things. Can I, if I can be allowed to actually ask a question of my colleagues here of something that came up but hasn't been discussed as much and intrigues me, and I think others too, and that is this issue of food for fuel. And for a little while it became big on the political dial. Before other things started moving on the dial. But I suspect it's going to become big again, not just in the US because of its presidential cycles, but around the globe. Now, my personal view has always been that food for fuel was a bad idea when we did it with Saddam Hussein, and is not a particularly good idea when we do it in general. But this, and it's a different issue from agriculture for fuel, because not all biofuels need come from food crops. But could I ask the two of you, from your vantage points, the global and the local, what do you think are the future implications of discussions about biofuels? I know from the climate change community, they see it as a solution. What does it do to the worlds that you inhabit at the local level and the global level in terms of what's coming down the pike? Hans, maybe?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, it was seen as a real hype. Of course, it was seen as it was one of the solutions for the fuel prices as well as for the environment. But we didn't know all the facts. And for example, within the EU, we have set targets for 20% in I think 2020 for biofuels. And now we know for sure if we want to achieve those targets or those goals, it will have devastating effects on the environment worldwide, because it means that at least the production of biofuels in Brazil or Argentina and perhaps even Indonesia or Vietnam has to be doubled or tripled. And it will cause, of course, quite some force as well. Secondly, of course, then it's an easy. The easy answer was, okay, we have to go from the first generation to the second generation of biofuels. But again, at this moment, we don't have the technology for a large-scale second-generation production, and even the second-generation production has still quite some questions about sustainability and environmental aspects. So you see, and it will, of course, be. I think one of the main issues for the future, but how to deal with it, I think there are more questions at this moment than answers, because I said already at the opening, even if we want to make a choice between for food production and biofuel production, how are we going to influence the markets? Are we going to buy up markets? If we want to say you have to only to produce for food and not for biofuels, and what kind of international governance structure should we develop to deal with this issue? And I try to ask those questions, at least my minister tried to ask those questions, and to the FAO as well as at headquarters in New York, and she didn't get any answer.
Yeah, thank you. And again, sort of to me, it again exemplifies this thing of how we have taken essentially interlinked policy problems and tried to sort of break them down into bite-sized pieces, when that really doesn't work because the connections are lost. And if you are sitting in the climate negotiations, your interest in biofuels is very different from if you are sitting at FAO, from if you are sitting at the Ministry of Food and Food Quality and Nature and Agriculture. And part of the challenge there is how do we create governance systems that link these issues that we haven't been in the habit of. But what does it mean to the farmer, if anything?
It depends on the biofuel you're talking about. I know little about it, except that ethanol, maize-based ethanol, is one of the options. But the value added of turning that agricultural product into fuel, there is no facility in Africa that I know about at any scale that could transfer that raw commodity into a value-added product. So the farmers who are producing this and getting higher prices still have to buy fertilizer. These Green Revolution crops, The formula is lots of water, fertilizer, improved seed, all of which are commodities that have to be bought on an open market. Those prices very much affect whether or not farmers can participate. And so you may have an increased price for maize globally, and farmers might benefit from that, but of course the other costs are hitting them very hard, and they have to compete by purchasing, either from private companies or from the government, scarce resources in the form of seeds, improved seeds. And so they're caught, the small farmer is really caught in a difficult situation. And I think that the maize-based ethanol was a short-term bubble. I think we're falling back from that in terms of what it's going to do to U.S.-based production of maize. So the other products, from sugarcane to switchgrass, et cetera, those things I'm less familiar with.
Yeah, and that's where some of the current discussion is happening. But thank you very much. Also, thank you for, I wanted to open up and see if there are other questions. But you also raised the water issue again, which was raised by Hans, and it seems to me is another of those connections that we are kind of waiting on until it blows up in our face in some ways. And maybe that varies by where you are in the world. But again, talking about my country, Pakistan, sort of we grew up learning what a great agricultural producer we were until I went to engineering school and started looking at soil maps and realized we were sitting in the middle of this arid zone that was growing essentially because we had the world's largest contiguous irrigation network. And water as a commodity, Ambassador Dunbar rightly pointed out to me the unsustainability of these water bottles, for which I do apologize. But water is another one of those issues, of those competing claims, that if we continue to talk about it in these compartmentalized forms, we might end up exacerbating a number of things. But on that note, we have Ambassador Dunbar.
Thank you. This question stems from my needing to teach a class in the political economy of the Middle East in 3 hours and 44 minutes concerning sustainability and food security specifically. It has been considered laughable that Saudi Arabia for many years produced the world's most expensive wheat to the point where it was able to export it. Saudi Arabia in the 1980s was a net exporter of wheat, and the cost of producing it was astronomical. Being a contrary, I want to have a discussion in the class this afternoon. At the moment, as I sit and think about some of the things that you've said and think about the way the world is going to look in the future, can any of you speculate about a situation in which the Saudis might be right, i.e., you speak of great scarcity, potential for big problems. The textbook that I teach says simply that they should be concerned about food security rather than food self-sufficiency. And that was, so they stopped producing it. They read the textbook and decided that they shouldn't do it. Can you envisage a situation, given their resources, notably a very, very large feedstock for desalinating water, and of course the Saudis were getting their water from a non-renewable aquifer, a very large aquifer that lies in between, I guess, the oil patches under the Desert Kingdom. Can you envisage a situation in which perhaps food security might be a better strategy for them? And if you just give me 3 no's, I will simply walk out, and thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
Either of you?
I think going back to the sort of core issue of what Sen suggested, that it's access, entitlements. The Saudis have got a great entitlement, which is money, capital, that they derive from another resource. So the flow of food, I think very little of what we've learned has to do with food security in terms of self-sufficiency. Societies across small scale, large scale have never had that problem. I mean, in some ways, if the Dutch are exporting in a major way agricultural goods, but nonetheless, European countries are a good example of how trade is much more important than internal production.
Yeah, perhaps two elements to your question, because we at this moment we have started a discussion within the European Union of the future of our European agriculture policy, and there, of course, two issues are getting most attention. That is food security within Europe and self-sufficiency, and of course, when you look to the economic elements, you have to look where can you produce in the most efficient and effective way, and that could mean that we are not producing a lot of food in Europe, but in Africa or in Asia. But then you get the political problem on the table, because then we are getting dependent for our food supplies from those regions, and we have learned our lesson with our gas supplies from Russia with the recent war, that we now say we have to have at least for a 75% self-sufficiency. We have to aim for a 75 self-sufficiency goal in about 10 years in Europe, and that means that we are going to produce crops which are not effective and efficient to be produced in, for example, Spain or in the Netherlands, but only because of the self-sufficiency and the political arguments we are going to produce them with too many costs. Also, when you look to not only the economic costs but also the environmental costs, and that's a problem I think which other regions are also facing. To what extent should we be self-sufficient? To what cost?
So you've already got two not no's. I'm not sure if those are yeses, but they're certainly not no's. And so let me add mine to that. The one word that hasn't come up here, which in a group like this I would have imagined would have come up if we were only talking about the global level, is food sovereignty. Right. So there are people who talk not only of food security but food sovereignty, as in more of the sufficiency argument, self-sufficiency argument, that it's not only important that I be able to secure food, but that I have control over the food that I desire. And I think what Hans mentioned with the EU, and I think in some ways the French argument very often sounds like that. We are hearing that sort of an argument on oil in this country as well as elsewhere. It's not simply that I need to have the ability to get it from someone, but if I have the ability to have it myself, then other types of dependencies, political and others, are taken care of. And in some ways that does creep up in the food argument. I think what strikes me as both more funny and more sad than food is the fact that you can find in Pakistan, which actually does have one of the great rivers of the world, the Indus, bottled water that is bottled in the UAE. Which is entirely dry. And I think what that leads to is the thing that you were talking about, this extreme increase in desalinization capacity that is happening in the Middle East. It is happening for very different reasons. Desalinization technologies have come down in price drastically. And so our normal notions of who is water scarce, when you put up new islands to put up homes, you also put up new ways of getting water. And I think we haven't fully confronted that, but there is massive desalinization capacities being built all across the Gulf. And that creates opportunities and entitlements, as you rightly point out, that might change. I don't know where it goes, but I do know that both with food and with water, it changes the type of products that we thought we would get from certain parts of the world. Let me, since I had promised our guests we would end on time, this has been a wonderful, I want to give you both time for I want to ask one last question and see if you have any closing thoughts. But if nothing else, this is a wide-ranging conversation, and I think it ought to be. We've moved from literally the farm gate to geopolitics. But I think that is really what we want to do here at the Pardee Center, to try to explore some of those connections, which in our otherwise insulated worlds, we usually do not. Here's my last question for you, each of you, but I'll also ask you if you have any closing thoughts on anything as you think about this. In some ways, and you've brought the Green Revolution up a couple of times, we can like it or not, but the fact of the matter is that is a very interesting example globally of having kind of licked part of what we thought was the problem then. And so as you look into your crystal balls, or if you look forward, is this an issue of food that we have either the capacity or the willingness or the ability to lick this time again? Or are we going to continue hearing about food insecurity in new and complex ways as we move forward? Let me start with you, Jim.
I don't know. I would guess that what we're going to see is we've not really talked about water. Water is fundamental to the politics of the Middle East, of Southern Africa, of California and the Colorado Basin. Whatever part of the world, it's fundamental to agriculture, the ability to build, live in cities. You can't de-link that factor in the same way you can't de-link the need constantly to adjust science and research to what do we need next. For appropriate for small farmers, appropriate for huge farms, appropriate to lack of water. These things, we don't de-link them. And water is one thing that we probably should have talked about more prominently here.
Yeah, I fully agree. I know for sure that we have the ability to I think solve, and I said that solve quite some of the issues. But I doubt whether there will be the willingness worldwide, and especially in donor countries, to really do it. And secondly, besides the linkage to water and perhaps some other issues, what I see at the international level, and I think that's one of our main problems, and it's completely different from the substance, is that we are not dealing with these issues at the international level or regional level in an integrated way. Because when we speak to, for example, the huge amount of attention which is given to climate change, we have experts from all the countries, also from the Netherlands, who are doing these negotiations on climate change. But they are not addressing the interlinkage with agriculture because they don't have the knowledge of agriculture. And we have done that in the past with many of the environmental treaties, like the biodiversity treaty, like some of the forest treaties. And only if we are capable of, at the international level, when we are taking decisions where we not only address climate change, but also address, for example, agriculture and the water issue in the same arena, with people who really understand it, which also can ask the right questions for research. I think then we are getting a little bit closer of finding some solutions also at the international level.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both. As I said, thank you very much again for a really interesting, complex but honest conversation. On behalf of the Pardee Center, I can promise you we will do something on water. And we will do more than one on water. But I really wanted to thank both our guests for coming here. We have a little gift for you, but more than that, we have the gratitude of the Pardee Center and of our audience. Thank you very much.